Late one night in 2004, a young woman was asleep in her downstairs bedroom when she suddenly was awoken by a bright light shining in through her bedroom window. The motion sensor light outside on the garage had been tripped. The young woman, who was sitting on her bed by this point, squinted and tried to look outside to see what had caused this, but she couldn't see anything, and so she just assumed it had to have been a neighborhood cat or something that had tripped the sensor. So she lay back down and was nearly back to sleep when something else caused her to suddenly sit up wide awake in her bed. But this time, it was not a bright light. It was a sound, footsteps to be exact. And these footsteps were not outside. They were inside her house, right outside of her bedroom door. Seconds later, this woman would live a nightmare. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to pick up the Amazon Music follow button after their work shift is over, but don't show up, and instead just keep sending them periodic text messages that promise you are only 5 minutes away. Okay, let's get into today's story. The weather on Halloween evening in Napa, California was perfect. The sky was clear and the air was cool without being cold. And all along Dorset Street, that year's most popular costumes were on display. It was October 31st, 2004, and the tree-lined neighborhood of small but pricey houses was a parade ground for pastel-colored princesses, black vampires, smiling yellow SpongeBobs, and Power Rangers in 6 different bright colors. Trailing behind and alongside these trick-or-treaters were parents who were shining their flashlights at the skull and bones and headstones planted in front yards and at the strings of orange lights around doorways. The whole scene was a snapshot of what made Napa such a desirable place to live. Located just north of San Francisco, the trendy city of 70,000 residents still had a small-town vibe. Spread out around it were miles of green hillsides, covered with the acres of grapevines that had made the Napa Valley the premier wine-producing region in the United States. And tucked inside of this agricultural wonderland, the city of Napa was both beautiful and safe. And on this particular Halloween night, if there was one house on Dorset Street that radiated that feeling of safety and warmth, it was number 2631. Barely 900 square feet in size, the olive green 1.5-story home with the white trim and the attached 2-car garage looked almost doll-sized. Hardly big enough for the 3 26-year-old women who had all moved in there together over the course of the last 9 months. 2 of those roommates, Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Insania, had been busy all evening passing out big handfuls of candy. Their excitement about this first Halloween together in this little house could be heard loud and clear as they oohed and awed over the little visitors trooping past the effigy of a witch hanging from the outside porch ceiling to knock on the front door. The 2 roommates who greeted the trick-or-treaters, Leslie and Adrienne, and their third roommate, who was sitting in the living room behind them, could not have been more different. Even before she got her degree in engineering, Adrienne had always loved building things. And in keeping with her hands-on and matter-of-fact approach to life, she had no problem telling people what was on her mind. Leslie was a former beauty queen from the Deep South who moved with the grace of someone who had spent 15 years of her life taking ballet lessons. She also had so much natural charm and magnetism that the first time she had visited one of the most famous vineyards in Napa Valley, she had immediately been offered a job. 6 months later, and Leslie had been promoted twice to her current position as a sales coordinator at the winery named after the famous Hollywood film director Francis Ford Coppola. Even the children who were there to get candy seemed immediately taken with Leslie. From her always expertly applied makeup to her long southern drawl, Leslie had stood out from the crowd from the moment she had arrived in Napa just 6 months earlier. But the children weren't just seeing Leslie's striking green eyes and friendly smile. As one of Leslie's admirers had once said, when looking for words to describe Leslie's deeper beauty, it was like trying to describe a rainbow to someone who couldn't see. In contrast to Adrienne and Leslie's outgoing personalities, the third roommate at 2631 Dorset Street, 26-year-old Lauren Minza, was the quietest and the neatest of the 3 women. As the volleyball coach of the local community college, Lauren had no trouble yelling out encouragement and instruction to her students, but when it came to any sort of social confrontation, Lauren held back and usually just let Adrian do the talking. Of the three women, Lauren and Adrian had been the first to move into this rented house on Dorset Street. After graduating from California's Polytechnic State University in 2001, Adrian had returned to her childhood home in Napa Valley and almost immediately got hired in as an assistant engineer at the Napa Sanitation District. It was there, at the Sanitation District, that Adrian had met the person who would become her best friend, a contract supervisor named Lily Prudhomme. Through Lily, Adrian quickly became part of a new circle of friends. A year or so later, at the start of 2004, Adrian had met Lauren for the first time at a volleyball class they both took at Napa Community College. And in February, when Lauren found the little house on Dorset Street, she had asked Adrian to move in and share the rent. As for Lauren, her social life had taken off on the day Adrian had arrived at 2631 Dorset. In typical Adrian fashion, Lauren's new roommate did not arrive alone. Right behind Adrian, carrying cartons and furniture, were Lily and her boyfriend Eric and another friend named Ben, all of whom helped Adrian and Lauren settle into their new home. In the space of that one day, Lauren had been welcomed into Adrian and Lily's circle. And by the time all the moving boxes were empty, the whole group of them had been laughing and talking over pizza and beer. Leslie, the last roommate to arrive at 2631 Dorset Street, had walked into their lives 4 months after that pizza party. Leslie had actually been living right next door to them for several weeks, and in passing conversations, Lauren had felt an instant connection to Leslie. Lauren liked Leslie's sense of fun, and even more, Leslie's genuine warmth and interest in other people. So when Leslie's roommates made plans to move out, Lauren and Adrian invited Leslie to move in with them. Before long, the upstairs bedroom across from Adrian's was filled with Leslie's clothes, perfume, and makeup. Leslie's arrival had definitely changed the dynamic at 2631, but in a fun way. While Adrian had arrived at the little house with a tight but small circle of close friends, Leslie arrived with an army, not just friends, but acquaintances and more male admirers than she could even count. And those were just the people Leslie knew in Napa. Her phone was filled with contacts from her life in Georgia and South Carolina, including ex-boyfriends who still made regular calls to Leslie, hoping to rekindle an old romance. But despite her busy social life and being involved with at least 2 different men at the same time, inside 2631, Leslie had respected her roommates' expectation of privacy. For the most part, if any of them wanted to spend the night with a boyfriend, they did it quietly and very infrequently, or they spent the night at the man's house. But that October, Leslie had started breaking that unspoken house rule, causing the first and only real conflict among the 3 roommates. 3 nights before Halloween, on October 28th, Leslie and one of her dates had made so much noise in Leslie's bedroom that Adrian and Lauren decided it was time to call a house meeting. Lauren had dreaded what she expected would turn into an awful confrontation, something she totally hated, but with her amazing charm and tact, Leslie had managed to diffuse the situation. Before the women even sat down together, Leslie sent both Lauren and Adrian an email apologizing for putting them in such an awkward situation and costing them most of one night's sleep. The roommates' ability to resolve the situation with some simple rules about having men over, rather than arguing or fighting about it, had felt like a win for all 3 women. And by Halloween day, everything felt right again with the world. The handyman that their landlord hired was outside working on the house, and that afternoon, Lauren spent a few hours out playing soccer and running errands. Meanwhile, Leslie and Adrian, all strain forgotten, were busy in the kitchen together, making Halloween-themed cupcakes and planning the next big holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. By around 9 p.m. on Halloween night, nearly all the adults and trick-or-treaters along Dorset Street had all gone home, and the front door light at 2631 had been turned off, leaving the witch and the little patch of pumpkins in the front yard in darkness. Inside the small green house, the empty bowls of candy had been put away, and the 3 roommates were all looking forward to a quiet Sunday evening before the start of a new work week. Adrian was the only one of the women who had plans to go out that night. As she got ready to go visit her boyfriend, Christian Lee, who lived only a few blocks away, Lauren and Leslie settled onto the couch to watch one of their favorite TV shows. At 9:30 p.m., Leslie got a call on her phone and headed upstairs, where she would get another 2 calls, this time from the father of one of her ex-boyfriends that she'd left behind in South Carolina. Looking at the 2 calls come in, Leslie sighed and let them go to voicemail. She'd listen to them later, or not at all. Suddenly tired, Leslie called a good night down to Lauren, and a few minutes later, Leslie was in bed. Meanwhile, Adrian's visit with Christian had ended in an argument. Adrian was ready for the 2 of them to make a serious commitment to one another, but Christian was not ready. As Adrian left Christian's a little after 10 p.m. and began heading home, all she could think about was Lily. Here, Adrian was wanting more from her partner, Christian, while 4 months ago, her best friend, Lily, had moved in the opposite direction with her partner, canceling or at least delaying her plans to marry Eric. Letting herself through the door of 2631 about a half hour later, Adrian reminded herself that love was just not easy. And after saying hello to Lauren and her dog Chloe, Adrian made her way up the stairs to her bedroom, directly across the tiny landing from Leslie's bedroom. By 11 p.m., Lauren and Chloe were also tucked in for the night in Lauren's downstairs bedroom. Just a few minutes before, after letting Chloe outside in the backyard one final time, Lauren had done what the last person to bed always did. She'd made sure all the doors were locked, including the garage door and the back sliding door. Then she had turned out all the indoor and outdoor lights, glanced one last time around the cozy house she called home, stepped inside her bedroom, and closed the bedroom door behind her. 2.5 hours later, a little after 1:30 in the morning, Lauren woke up suddenly to a flash of bright light and a bark from Chloe, who was lying on the bed next to her. Outside her window, the motion sensor light attached to the garage had clicked on. Lauren waited, listening, but heard nothing. Turning back over in her bed, Lauren murmured to Chloe that it must have been a neighborhood cat out on the prowl. But just minutes later, Lauren found herself wide awake a second time. And this time, it wasn't the outside light. This time, she'd been awakened by a sound coming from inside the house. Shushing her growling dog, Lauren listened intently, and she heard quiet footsteps making their way up the stairs towards the second floor where the other 2 roommates were sleeping. Lauren's first thought was that Leslie must have broken their new house rule and invited a man over to spend the night, and that was him kind of sneaking into the house to be with her. Annoyed, Lauren did her best to quiet Chloe and go back to sleep. But just a few minutes later, at about 2 a.m., in the early morning hours of November 1st, Lauren heard the first scream. Lauren and her dog instantly bolted upright. It was obvious that that scream had not been from lovemaking. And a moment later, Lauren's confusion turned to panic and terror as she heard a second scream coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of a violent struggle in the room directly above her. Furniture being shoved aside, things falling on the floor, the stamping of bare feet and shoes. And then Lauren heard Adrian's voice raised to a shout, "Oh my God, please help, please help!" Without turning her light on, Lauren stumbled out of her bed. She opened the door of her room and took one step into the dark hallway. For half a minute, Lauren just stood there listening, paralyzed with shock and fear, until suddenly she heard the sound of the glass light fixture at the top of the second floor landing break. And then she heard pounding footsteps as the intruder seemed to fly down the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, coming directly towards her. Jolted into action by a huge rush of adrenaline, Lauren reached down, grabbed Chloe, and turned toward the back door of the house. But no sooner had she stepped through the sliding door onto the patio and out onto the cold, damp grass than Lauren realized her mistake. The backyard was completely surrounded by a 6-foot-high fence, with no way for Lauren to escape. Terrified, Lauren dragged Chloe with her into a thicket of bushes, and just above the thudding of her own heart, Lauren could suddenly hear, from inside the house, the clack of the wooden window blinds in the kitchen. The sound told her one thing. The intruder had not followed her into the backyard. They were somewhere in the front of the house where the kitchen was. And then, when the clacking sound stopped, Lauren thought she heard a window break. Whoever had been inside the house must have left. And then, in the sudden quiet, Lauren heard it again. Adrian's faint but desperate cries for help. A moment later, Lauren crawled out from the cover of the bushes, and then, feeling her way in the darkness, she re-entered the house through the back door, and as carefully and quietly as she could, she picked up the receiver of the kitchen phone to call 911. But all she heard was the beep 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 of a busy signal. And in her mind's eye, Lauren pictured the phone upstairs, the receiver knocked off its hook during that terrible struggle she'd heard just a few minutes earlier. Lauren put the phone down, and then, taking a deep breath and praying she was right, that the intruder was gone, she tiptoed to the front of the house, turned, and then began to climb the stairs. She was careful not to touch the dark smears along the right side of the staircase that she knew were blood, focusing instead on the light that was coming from one of the bedrooms. Reaching the tiny landing, Lauren stepped around the broken glass light fixture on the floor and turned so she was looking through the door into Leslie's room. But before Lauren could even register the feeling of wet blood on the floor under her bare feet, Lauren saw Adrian. Her friend was crouching in a narrow space between the wall and Leslie's bed. But something was terribly wrong. Adrian's face and neck and arms were covered in blood. As Lauren rushed over to help her friend, Adrian made an effort to speak, but all Lauren heard was a long, gurgling breath deep in Adrian's throat. It was at that point that Lauren noticed something else. On top of the bed, in a pile of blankets and clothes, she saw the body of her other roommate. Leslie lay face down and motionless, with deep cuts all across her back and upper arms. Lauren tried not to slip in the blood as she backpedaled out of Adrian's room. Turning on the landing, Lauren ran down the stairs, she grabbed her cell phone out of her bedroom, and she punched in 911. By the time police and medical emergency vehicles had pulled up to the curb outside 2631 Dorset Street at 2:13 a.m., Lauren and her dog Chloe were still sitting inside of Lauren's car. Afraid that whoever had attacked her friends might come back for her, Lauren had grabbed her dog, jumped into her car, cell phone pressed to her ear, and driven up and down the street as she begged the emergency dispatch operator to send help, and did her best to describe what had happened. She said, "Both my roommates are hurt. I think they're dying." The first officers on the scene set up a loose defensive perimeter around the house. Before letting the emergency personnel inside 2631, 4 other officers, guns drawn, cleared the inside of the little house to make sure it really was empty, except for the 2 victims. The police, who had reached Adrian just before she died, later described the carnage in the upstairs bedrooms as the bloodiest crime they'd ever seen. Meanwhile, wrapped in a blanket and standing outside the house, Lauren told an officer trained in questioning victims of trauma all that she could remember about the attack, from the moment the light flicked on in the backyard to the calls she had just made to 911 operators. And as Lauren would repeat over and over again to police and later to the families of Adrian and Leslie, no, at no point had Lauren seen the intruder's face or noticed any details that would help police identify who had attacked her roommates. And no, Lauren had absolutely no idea who would want to hurt either Leslie or Adrian. By 2:30 a.m. on November 1st, the little house on Dorset Street, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape, was lit up in the glow of portable floodlights. Most crime scenes yield maybe 2 to 3 pieces of physical evidence, but over the next 2 days, the crime scene techs, who were now combing the inside and outside of 2631, would collect a whopping 71 pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, as small groups of neighbors began to gather together in the street, whispering to each other and calling out questions to the police, Napa Police Detective Todd Schulman was already giving the orders that would get the investigation going. The 4-year veteran investigator assigned officers to canvass neighbors and the growing crowd outside to see if anyone remembered seeing anything or anyone that night that was out of place or suspicious. And based on what Lauren had been able to tell police about her roommate's work, personal and social lives, the detective also ordered his team to start interviewing friends, coworkers, boyfriends, and acquaintances of the 2 victims. And by mid-morning, 7 hours after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, police would be knocking on the doors of Adrian's best friend, Lily Prudhomme, and Adrian's boyfriend, Christian Lee. Further away, at the vineyard where Leslie worked, her co-workers would also be questioned by police, and as police began gathering information about Leslie's social life, so would a long list of Leslie's current and former boyfriends. But even as police fanned out around Napa and began working the phones to trace Leslie's connections in South Carolina and Georgia, crime scene techs had already collected evidence that would wind up making a big cut in the possible pool of suspects. By Thursday, November 3rd, 4 days after the early morning double murder, the police knew that the killer was a male, a finding that ruled out the female half of the US population. Forensic investigators had been able to collect several critical pieces of physical evidence from the crime scene that would all contain samples of the killer's DNA. There was a packet of plastic zip ties, the kind that could be used to bind a person's wrists, that the killer had dropped just under the front window, where they entered and then later exited the house. There was also a smear of blood that did not belong to the victims on the aluminum siding of the house near the window. And finally, police had found 3 cigarette butts in the front and backyard of 2631. DNA from all 3 pieces of evidence was identical, and it showed, without a doubt, that the killer was a man. Unfortunately, what the DNA did not reveal was the identity of this man. The DNA would turn out not to match the DNA sample that police had collected from Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, and when the DNA results were run through a nationwide database of more than 4 million known criminal offenders, there was no match there either. Although the police would not release this information to the public for another 2 weeks, the DNA results did clear any females, including Lauren and Lily, of any involvement in the murders. And even though Detective Schulman could not completely rule out the possibility that the murders of Adrian and Leslie were just the result of a burglary gone horribly wrong, the DNA results showing the killer was a man did support the investigators' emerging theory of the murder. The violence of the attack suggested the killer had a personal motive. And with Adrian's boyfriend off the suspect list, and given the number of men who had been close to or involved with Leslie, police began to focus on Leslie as the killer's prime target, and Adrian must have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness who had to be eliminated. Still, there was a second theory about these murders, a theory that would make this case even harder to solve, and one that was already keeping terrified residents of Napa awake at night. That theory was that the murders were the work of a serial killer, a person with no connection to their victims, a killer who might strike again at any moment or leave without a trace and continue to kill somewhere else. Within days of the murders, local security companies saw an uptick in the number of people in Napa County requesting the installation of alarm systems. And by November 9th, the day of Adrian's funeral, the 350 mourners who watched a video showing Adrian's progression through life from childhood to engineer were talking to one another in hushed whispers about a killer who could be lurking in every backyard. One day later, on Wednesday, November 10th, the city of Napa offered a $100,000 reward, money collected from local businesses, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever had killed Adrian and Leslie. But despite the size of that reward, and despite the long list of potential suspects in the murder, most of them connected in some way to Leslie Mazzara, as November 2004 came to a close, police had still not made any arrests. And by December 2nd, 1 month after the Halloween night murders, Napa's police commander was offering a very sobering update on the investigation. So far, progress had consisted of what police figured out had not happened at 2631 Dorset Street. Investigators had ruled out domestic violence. They had also ruled out any gang-related connections to the murder, a lead that popped up when they found out that Leslie's father was serving back-to-back life sentences in Florida for his role in a murder conspiracy. Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, had also been ruled out as a suspect, along with that father of one of Leslie's ex-boyfriends who had called Leslie twice the night before she was killed, and the handyman who had been working on the roommate's house on Halloween day. But according to the commander, the lack of progress had nothing to do with a lack of effort on the part of law enforcement. In the days after the murders, several other high-profile agencies had joined forces with the Napa police. Those included a response team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Napa County Major Crime Investigations Team, the California Department of Justice, and a handful of recently retired local detectives who had been rehired to help investigate this case. And behind the scenes, police had collected DNA swabs from almost 200 men who had some connection with the victims, and investigators had conducted nearly 1,000 interviews across 8 different states. Still, it just wasn't enough. Standing up in front of a packed press conference, the commander of the Napa Police Department told the public that 1 month after the murder, law enforcement had nothing to indicate that they were going to solve this case, quote, today, tomorrow, or next week, end quote. And if anything, that prediction turned out to be a very big understatement. Because over the next 10 months, the only breakthrough on the case was the use of a new DNA analysis tool that allowed police to further narrow down their suspect pool. In addition to knowing that the murderer was male, police now knew with good certainty that he was also of Northern European descent with possibly blonde hair and blue or green eyes. But while this ruled out suspects of color, it wasn't enough of a break to lead police to their killer. In the meantime, as the investigation dragged on, friends of Adrian and Leslie tried very hard to keep the memory of these 2 women alive and to move forward with their own lives. In between candlelight vigils, fundraisers, and interviews with the media about Adrian and Leslie, there was only one bright spot. Inviting their friends and Adrian's family to join them, Lily and Eric got married in a celebration of life service at the Big White Episcopal Church on 3rd Street in Napa. It would not be until the fall of 2005, almost a year after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, that investigators finally got the break they needed to solve the so-called Halloween homicides. After basically running out of options for kickstarting an investigation that had ground to a halt, the Napa Police Department had decided to go public with one of the details in the case that they had been keeping a secret. Holding back evidence is a common practice in investigations. Investigators like to use undisclosed information to help confirm whether a suspect actually knows details about the crime that have not been made public. It also helps police rule out false confessions. In this case, the detail related to the cigarette butts that had been picked up by crime scene techs in the front and backyards of 2631 Dorset Street early on the morning of the murders. In August 2005, 9 months after those cigarette butts were collected and tested for DNA, further analysis had revealed that the cigarettes themselves, Camel Turkish Golds, were very unusual. Not only did the cigarettes have distinctive markings around the filter, they had only been on the market for 14 months, and they were only sold in Napa by a handful of stores. A month later, on September 21st, in a last-ditch effort to jog the memory of anyone who might know a smoker of Turkish Gold cigarettes, Detective Schulman released the name and description of the cigarettes to the local media, calling the information an important new piece of evidence in the Halloween murders. And for one television viewer, that evening's headline story about these Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes immediately struck a nerve. Sitting in a house just 2 miles away from the place where Adrian and Leslie had been killed 11 months earlier, the viewer suddenly stiffened up in his chair and turned up the volume on the TV set. As the newscaster ran through the latest details in the murder investigation, the young man watching knew that he had information that could be vital to the police trying to solve this case. Leaning forward, the young man clicked through other news stations on TV to see if he could find out any more information on what police were calling a breakthrough. 5 days later, on September 27th, Detective Schulman got a call from the Napa police station. Someone had just walked into the station asking for a detective and said he had important eyewitness testimony related to the murders of Adrian and Leslie. Based on this person's information, along with follow-up interviews and additional investigation by law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what police and forensic experts believe happened to Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara on the night they were killed. For the killer, Sunday, October 31st, 2004, was a day of terrible disappointment. And at that party, on that Halloween night, as the killer looked around the table at the people sitting there and playing cards with him, his feelings of jealousy, anger, and resentment just kept getting stronger and stronger. Those feelings were helped along by all the alcohol, 1 drink for every hand of cards he lost, and the killer was losing the game badly. By the time the killer had been driven back to his house, he was so drunk he had trouble standing up, and by the time he stumbled into the empty apartment, he couldn't even remember getting dropped off at his own front door. But sometime after midnight, after waking up from a short sleep, the killer was sober enough to make a plan for that night and early morning that did not involve going back to bed. Instead, the killer had decided to go confront at least one of the people that he held responsible for the emotional pain he was feeling. And on his way out to his car, the killer stopped in his garage and put together his murder kit, a packet of plastic ties secured with a rubber band, and a sharp knife with a 4 to 5 inch long blade. Then, just before hopping into his car and heading for his destination, the killer patted his coat pocket, making sure he had a pack of his favorite cigarettes, the only brand he smoked now, Camel Turkish Gold. 10 minutes later, when the killer arrived at the little house at 2631 Dorset Street, he parked the car across the street and turned off the engine. Before getting out, he sat for a while in the darkness, looking at the orange pumpkins on the lawn and the witch with the green face twisting from one of the ceiling rafters of the front porch. Then the killer opened the car door and walked across the street until he was facing the closed white garage door of 2631. Standing there quietly, he pulled out his packet of cigarettes and began to smoke, while he lifted his eyes to stare at the upstairs windows. When he flicked one of his cigarette butts out of his hand and into the grass, the sudden movement was picked up by a motion sensor and the backyard light suddenly turned on, temporarily blinding him. But even though this startled him, and he might have even considered turning around and going back home, he ultimately decided to continue with his plan. He moved from the white garage doors across the front lawn to the front door, where he gently tried turning the knob. But the door was locked. However, that didn't mean the windows were locked too. Taking out his knife, the killer stepped from the door over to one of the front windows. And sure enough, when he inserted the blade between the windowsill and the window sash, he could feel the upward give as he pried the window open. And once he was able to slip his fingers under the sash, it was easy to push the window open all the way, giving him plenty of room to crawl inside. On his way into the house, the killer didn't notice that he had dropped his packet of zip ties secured with a rubber band that had soaked up a sample of his sweat and DNA. Once inside, the killer let his eyes adjust to the darkness, and then he stepped a little to his right, towards the stairs that led to the 2 upper bedrooms. Once upstairs, the killer turned into Leslie's room first. Seeing the sleeping woman on the bed in front of him, he stepped closer and stared down at her. Then, raising his knife high in the air, the murderer brought it down with all his force directly into Leslie's heart. Leslie had time for one short scream before the killer raised the knife and stabbed her again and again. But that scream had been enough to wake up Adrienne in the little bedroom across the hall. Switching on the light, she could see that someone, an intruder, was inside of Leslie's room. A moment later, and Adrienne was out of bed and stepping through the open door across the hallway to help her friend and roommate. The killer looked up, locked eyes with Adrienne, and then he attacked, striking her with the knife. And when Adrienne fought back, the killer struck again and again and again, leaving cuts and wounds all over her upper body, arms, and hands, along with a deep gash across her face and neck. The frenzied attack had left blood everywhere, in pools on the floor and spatter marks along the walls and the bed. But from the very start of their struggle, Adrienne had begun to shout and call out for help, and she did not stop. And even as Adrienne began to bleed out, her cries were so loud that the killer panicked. Running out of the bedroom, he turned on the landing, smashed the glass light fixture on the wall before pounding down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, leaving streaks of bright red blood where his fingers had touched the wall. Once he reached the bottom of the stairs, the killer raced for the front window, causing the wooden blinds to clatter as he jimmied himself through the opening and back out onto the front porch. This time, the smear of blood he left on the exterior aluminum siding was his own. At some point, he had cut himself, leaving a clear DNA marker alongside the window. A moment later, the killer had reached his car, yanked open the driver's side door, thrown the bloody knife onto the back seat, and headed for the freeway that would take him home. It's believed the killer either didn't know Lauren was still there at the property, or he simply was too panicked from all the screaming and chaos happening upstairs that he did not want to stick around any longer. Either way, Lauren was ultimately spared. Back at his apartment, the killer stripped off his blood-stained clothes and took them out to the backyard. Building a fire in the fire pit, he fed the clothes and his shoes into the bright orange flames. Later that same morning, when Lily Prudhomme heard the news that Leslie and Lily's own best friend Adrian had been murdered, Lily was absolutely heartbroken. And the one person who was there right from the start to help her cope with this terrible loss was her boyfriend and killer, Eric Koppel. It would turn out that Eric Koppel had been devastated when Lily had called off their wedding back in August of 2004. He knew he had a drinking problem, and he knew he suffered from deep depression, but to Eric, Lily was the most important person in his life, and he could not imagine living without her. Despite canceling their wedding, the two of them were still living together, and on Halloween, the two of them had gone to a party together, where Eric would start playing a drinking card game. But the more Eric drank at that party, the more he kept thinking that October 31st was just hours away from the day, November 1st, 2004, that should have been his wedding day. And instead of getting married to Eric, Lily had planned to spend what would have been their honeymoon on a trip not with him, but with her best friend Adrian, one of the people, Eric was sure of this, who had probably told Lily that she could do much better than Eric. But it wasn't until Eric had made one final plea that night, asking Lily again to marry him and set a new date for their wedding, that Eric's bitterness overflowed. Lily, angry at how intoxicated Eric was, said no to his marriage proposal, and when she drove him home that night, she didn't stay with him at their apartment. Instead, she went to her parents' house. As Eric Koppel would later tell police when he confessed to the double murder of Adrian and Leslie, he only remembered bits and pieces of what happened in the early hours of November 1st. He would never say exactly why he had killed the two women, and his own story of how he had committed the murders was different from the reconstruction police had put together based on forensic evidence and the autopsy reports on Leslie and Adrian. According to Eric, he had gone first to Adrian's room to lie down and sleep on a pile of blankets at the foot of her bed. When Adrian woke up, turned on the light, and saw Eric, he attacked her to keep her from crying out. And then, forgetting exactly how or why, Eric told police he had gone into Leslie's room and stabbed her too before running down the stairs and leaving by the front window. And after the murders, Eric had been such a comfort to Lily that 5 months later, the two of them were married in a ceremony that featured a special reading by none other than Adrian's mother, Arlene Allen. Eric made his confession to police on September 27th, 5 days after he had seen on TV the news story in which police linked the killer in the Halloween murders to a white male with light hair and eyes who smoked Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes. It was a brand that was so distinctive that when police had asked Lauren if she or Adrian or Leslie knew anyone who smoked Turkish Golds, Lauren was able to give investigators one name, Eric Koppel. Eric was one of the people who had helped Adrian move into the little house on Dorset Street back in February of 2004, 8 months before Adrian and Leslie were killed. And Eric was one of the only members of Adrian's inner circle who had never been questioned by police or asked for a DNA sample. By the time the news story about the cigarettes had aired, Eric could already feel the net tightening around him. He knew from earlier news coverage that police had recovered the killer's DNA from the scene and that the blood, saliva, tissue, and sweat were his. And as the killer's DNA profile came into clearer focus, a white male of Northern European descent with light hair and light eyes who smoked these Turkish Gold cigarettes, it was a face Eric recognized every time he looked into a mirror. After starting in late summer, before Turkish Gold cigarettes had made the headlines, police, acting on Lauren's tip, had already begun calling Eric. Until then, Eric had slipped below police radar. A quiet and religious 26-year-old land surveyor, he did not appear to have close personal ties with either Adrian or Leslie. And while police collected 218 DNA samples from men known to be among the victim's circle of friends and acquaintances, they did not collect any samples from Eric. When Eric arrived at the police station on September 27th, 11 months after he had killed Adrian and Leslie, he didn't come alone. After seeing the TV news story about the Turkish Gold cigarettes, Eric apparently wrote suicide letters to his family. In response to those letters, his family urged him to go to the police. And so when Eric walked alone into the police interrogation room, the family members who had accompanied him sat waiting for him in the lobby. Despite the differences between the police reconstruction of the crime and the story that Eric told them, Eric Koppel was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara. Police were very skeptical that Eric could be sober enough to plan and carry out 2 murders, stand outside his victim's house smoking cigarettes, and later destroy evidence of his crime, but also be so drunk that he was unable to remember actually stabbing and killing his victims, and unable to recall what he had done with the murder weapon, which was never found. On Tuesday, December 5th, 2006, just 2 months after the second anniversary of the Halloween murders, Eric Koppel pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. That guilty plea meant that the families of his victims would be spared a potentially painful jury trial, and it also meant that Eric would not face a possible death sentence. Instead, Eric was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his time at Corcoran Prison, a correction center in California designed specifically to house inmates who have a substance abuse disorder. At Eric's sentencing, Adrian's best friend, Lily, told a packed courtroom there was nothing in the world that Eric could do to make her love him less. 2 years later, though, in 2008, the couple got a divorce. Later, Lily would enroll as a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she would write a doctoral dissertation on forgiveness. At around 8 p.m. on December 16, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. You know, he didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console, and so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip, but then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink, and he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand, and instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder, and then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed, he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor, amazingly, was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that, he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. I mean, the deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? Like, he can't really do anything. It's nighttime. So he made the decision that, nobody saw this and it seems like everything's okay. So I'm just going to drive home and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead. And he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, like, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. I mean, the whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's like one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. So Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down, and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, get out of the car. He's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, what happened tonight? Like, what's going on here? And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot, and so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it. And as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police. But the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking. And then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood. Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police. But, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. Our next story is called Ancient Beast. On August 25th, 2010, a small twin-engine propeller plane sat on the tarmac at Kinshasa International Airport in the Congo. As the plane was being refueled, the co-pilots, 62-year-old Danny Philomot from Belgium and 39-year-old Chris Wilson from England, walked up the stairs and into the cockpit. As the pilots got settled in and began their internal systems checks, the flight attendant walked up the stairs, she said hello to the pilots, and then she began preparing the cabin for the passengers. The main cabin began boarding at 11 a.m., and by 11:30 a.m., all 18 passengers that were expected to board had taken their seats. So the flight attendant closed the doors, went into the cockpit, and told the pilots they were ready for takeoff. This was going to be a 1-hour-long routine domestic flight to Bandundu, which is a province that was just outside the border of Kinshasa to the east. This particular crew had made this flight dozens of times in the past without any issues. As the little plane made its way over to the runway, the flight attendant demonstrated what to do in case of various in-flight emergencies, and then by noon, the plane was airborne. 1 hour later, residents of a town located just southwest of Bandundu remembered looking up into the sky and seeing the small prop plane falling through the clouds in a near vertical nosedive. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the ground right in the middle of the neighborhood. Luckily, the crash did not kill anybody on the ground, but unfortunately, the pilots, the flight attendant, and 17 of the 18 passengers died on impact. And the one passenger that survived was very badly hurt and was left in a coma. An investigation was launched into what happened, and very quickly it was theorized that they must have run out of gas, because when they hit the ground there was no explosion, there was no fire, but upon closer inspection it would turn out the plane had plenty of fuel. The black box, which is a device that records the audio inside the cockpit, was recovered, but unfortunately it was inoperable, so it didn't give them any other clues as to what happened. Investigators were stumped. Did they strike a bird in the air? Did the engines suddenly fail? Was it operator error? They didn't know. A few days after the crash, the one surviving passenger miraculously came out of their coma and remembered in vivid detail what happened up in the skies right before they crashed. They said as the plane was making their final descent into Bandundu, the flight attendant was walking down the aisle reminding everyone to put away their big devices and put their seat in the upright position, and as she got about halfway down the aisle, she looked towards the back of the plane and she suddenly gasped and covered her mouth, turned around and walked very quickly back towards the front of the plane into the cockpit where she disappeared. The passengers that had seen her do this were immediately concerned that something was wrong with the plane, and so they stood up and looked towards the rear of the plane where she had been looking, and right away they knew what it was she was concerned about. There was a hissing crocodile making its way up the aisle. Someone must have smuggled it on. And as passengers realized what was happening, they all panicked and stampeded towards the front of the plane. This sudden shift in weight threw off the plane's center of gravity, causing a nosedive that the pilots could not recover from before they crashed. After hearing this story, the investigators remembered that a living crocodile had been found around the wreckage, but no one had thought much of it because in the Congo, lots of exotic animals are smuggled onto flights. Specifically, crocodiles are smuggled onto these planes with such regularity that passengers often can recognize the very specific crocodile smell somewhere in the cabin. and they'll tell the pilots, he'll come back, they'll find the crocodile and the owner of said crocodile. They'll kick them off before takeoff. But obviously this time, nobody smelled the crocodile. The third and final story of today's episode is called Stay Forgetful. On the afternoon of July 13th, 1994, a man woke up feeling very confused and disoriented, and he felt some pain in the back of his head. And as he opened his eyes, he kind of slowly realized that he was on his back in a ditch on the side of the road, looking up at a big blue sky. The man tried to sit up, but as soon as he did, he felt this throbbing pain in the back of his head, and he reached back to touch it, but the second he did, it hurt even worse, and he definitely felt there was a pretty big lump on the back of his head. And then when he brought his hands in front of his face, he saw he had all these bruises around his wrists that he had no idea what they were from. And so as this man in the ditch is trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly this older man who he didn't know just appeared by the side of the road and looked down and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And so the guy in the ditch is looking at this guy. He's got no idea who he is. And he wants to say, what's going on? Where am I? Who am I? What's happening? But he couldn't find the words. It's like he just kept looking at this older guy, looking at his wrist and feeling his head and having no idea what's going on. But then for some reason, 3 names popped into this guy's head, the guy in the ditch. He thought of 3 names. He had no idea whose names these were, but for some reason, he felt like those names were really important. And so after a few minutes of awkward silence, as the guy in the ditch is trying to talk, he finally just blurts out these 3 names. He says, Pat, Joel, Chris. And so the older man who had asked the guy in the ditch what was going on, he didn't really know how to react to this guy blurting out these names. And so he kind of ignored it and just said, okay, hi, my name's Steve. And then Steve, the older man, helped the guy from the ditch out of the ditch. And then once the man in the ditch was on his feet, kind of looking around, he looked at Steve and suddenly he could say other words. And he said to Steve, "Where are we?" And Steve looked at him and said, "We're in Cheyenne, Wyoming." Now, the guy in the ditch didn't know why, but he immediately felt like Wyoming had to be wrong. There's no way he could be in Wyoming. But the guy in the ditch didn't know where he was supposed to be. He didn't know who Steve was. He didn't know who Pat, Joel, or Chris was. And so it's all totally confusing. And so he just stood there kind of saying nothing. And as he did, Steve said, "Hold on a minute, I'm going to get my stuff." And so Steve kind of shuffled down the road 10, 20 feet away, where there was a shopping cart full of cans, and there was a backpack and some other things dangling off the side. And as Steve grabbed the shopping cart, turned it around, and slowly began pushing it back towards the guy in the ditch stared at Steve and kind of put together that, Steve must be homeless. And this realization made the guy in the ditch think that, maybe he was homeless too. And so suddenly, instinctively, the guy from the ditch began reaching into his pockets, thinking maybe he had an ID or something that would show him who he was, that would show he was not homeless, that he had a place that he needed to go to. And he reached in his pockets, but there was nothing. All he found was 23 cents and a comb. And so by the time Steve came over with his cart and asked the guy from the ditch, "Hey, do you want to come to the shelter with me?" The guy from the ditch was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll go with you." And then once the guy from the ditch and Steve arrived at the shelter, when they went inside, the guy from the ditch had to introduce himself to the people who ran the shelter. And so he made up a name combining one of those names that was running through his head, Pat, with the color of the desk of the person who was asking him for his name inside of the shelter. And so he just called himself Pat Brown. And after Pat Brown got a room inside of the shelter, he went to bed that night, still having no idea what was going on, but he felt confident, if I just sleep tonight, I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll know what's going on. I'll figure out, what happened to me. But the next day when Pat woke up, he was still completely confused, did not know who he was, had no idea what was going on, but he had the wherewithal to know that, something bad must have happened to him. And maybe he should go talk to the police because maybe they would know if other people were looking for him or something. And so Pat walked from the shelter to the police station. It was not far away. And he went inside and very politely, he walked up to the desk. He introduced himself to the cop who was on duty. And Pat just began explaining to the cop as much as he could remember. He said, yesterday I woke up in a ditch. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I'm here. I think I have amnesia. I just keep thinking of 3 names in my head, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but I have no idea what they mean. Can you help me? Now, the cop who's hearing this did not think, "Oh my goodness, this is totally legitimate. Let's launch an investigation to figure out who you are." Instead, the cop is like, "Is this guy on drugs? Is he mentally ill? What's going on with this guy?" But the cop would say, Pat was incredibly polite and did not appear to be intoxicated. And so the cop humored him and said, okay, you know what? Let's look through the most recent missing person reports in the area to see if somebody matching your description, is a missing person. And so the cop began going through the database, but he couldn't find anybody that matched Pat's description. And so at some point he said, look, I can't really help you very much here because you're a grown man. You do not seem to be in distress here. And even though it's very unfortunate that you can't remember who you are or where you need to go or, where your family is, that's not really a police matter. But as he was saying this to Pat, who's kind of crestfallen, he's putting his hands near his face and just kind of reacting to this news that the police are not going to help him. And the police officer says, hold on a minute, look at your hand. And so Pat looked at his hand and he saw, there was no ring on his left ring finger, but there was a pretty obvious callus where a ring should have been. It looked like, Pat must have been wearing a ring up until recently, and for some reason it was now off. And so the cop said, hey, it looks like you may be married or were married for a long time because you got that callus. But, beyond that, I'm sorry, there's not much else I can offer you. And so even though this was somewhat valuable information, it didn't really point Pat in any direction. And so he was about to turn and leave when the cop said, hey, do you want to ride to the hospital? Because it seems like you could be having some sort of medical event here. But Pat politely declined and just told the officer to please be in touch with him if anybody came calling looking for somebody that kind of seemed like him. And the police officer said he would. And so after this, Pat left the station and went back to the shelter and basically told himself, I'm going to stay here and just wait until my memory comes back. Because at this point, that was kind of all he could do. However, weeks would go by at the shelter and nobody would contact the police looking for somebody like Pat Brown, and Pat wouldn't remember any more details. The only thing that kept coming into his head was those three names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but that was it. And so finally, after a few weeks of no progress being made, Pat decided he would leave the shelter in Cheyenne and go to Jackson, Wyoming, because some other people in the shelter had talked about Jackson, Wyoming as being a place where people who don't have ID cards could get jobs and basically start over. And because Jackson was only a little over 400 miles away from Cheyenne, it was not unreasonable to try to hitchhike your way to Jackson. And so almost exactly 2 months from the day Pat woke up inside of this ditch, he began hitchhiking his way towards Jackson. When Pat got to Jackson, he was able to get a job without an ID. He got a job at a newspaper sorting mail and doing some clerical work. And at first he stayed in a shelter like he had in Cheyenne until he had saved up enough money to rent a room. And as the months went by in Jackson, Pat did begin to remember additional details about what seemed like his former life. He discovered while doing clerical work at the newspaper that he was able to use an adding machine without looking at it. It was like his fingers just knew where to go. He also discovered that he was able to do really complex math problems in his head. And then also, in virtue of being at the newspaper, he saw a lot of information about the stock market, and he actually seemed to know a lot about the stock market, even though he didn't know why. Also, while Pat was in Jackson, he started to feel this really intense compulsion to go to a Catholic church. And so he began going to Catholic Mass, and while he was in church, he just automatically began saying the prayers along with everybody else, even though, again, he didn't really know why he had that information in his head. But the biggest clue that came back to Pat while he was in Jackson was this recurring dream he would have where he was at this campground somewhere and this little boy comes around the corner and looks up at Pat and says, "Hey Dad, Mom needs your help with Chris." And then in the dream, he responds to this child by saying, "Okay, Joel, I'll be right there." And so with all these clues kind of coming back into focus, Pat sort of felt like he had a grip on who he used to be. Based on the callus on his finger and on that recurring dream, it did seem like he was a married man who had at least 2 kids, Joel and Chris, and so his wife was very likely named Pat, or maybe Pat was another child he didn't know. And then also he felt like he must have been maybe an accountant or somebody who worked with numbers, based on the adding machine and understanding the stock market and complex math problems. And also he was a devout Catholic, because that's the only way he would know all those prayers. But despite kind of putting together who he seemed to be in his previous life, that didn't really tell him anything about what he should do now. Like, he didn't know where his potential family was, or where his job was, or where he should go. And so even though he had this kind of former life formed in his mind, he couldn't act on it. And so Pat's weird life in limbo in Jackson, Wyoming just kind of continued to drag on. And so by the end of 1997, so by this point, it's been 3.5 years since Pat has woken up in the ditch confused. He's still in Jackson, Wyoming. He still has no idea who he is. And it's starting to set in that unless he takes drastic measures here, he'll never figure out the truth about who he is. And so early in 1998, Pat does take drastic measure. He contacts a very popular TV show at the time called Unsolved Mysteries and asks them to please cover his story, because if they did, it would be broadcast across the country and maybe somebody out there would recognize him and come find him. And sure enough, when Pat contacted Unsolved Mysteries, they thought his story was totally insane and they covered it. Pat's episode aired on April 10th, 1998, almost exactly 4 years after Pat woke up in that ditch. And on the day his episode aired, in a city in Indiana, 1,500 miles away from Jackson, Wyoming, a phone rang in a woman's house. And so she answered it, and it was her cousin, and her cousin told her, "Stop whatever you're doing and turn on the TV, put it on channel CBS." And so this woman, she walks into the living room, she turns on the TV, flips it to CBS, and she sees an episode of Unsolved Mysteries is playing, and it's Pat Brown's episode. And this woman is staring at the TV, and she practically faints when she sees what it's about. But she stays composed and just stands there staring at the TV, so shocked she can't even say anything. And the whole time her cousin is yelling through the phone, saying, "Can you believe it? Oh my goodness." And then at some point on the TV, a phone number flashed at the bottom of the screen where the producers of the show told the audience, "Hey, if you know anything about this case, call this number." And so at this, the woman who's watching the TV, she hangs up on her cousin and she dials that number she sees on the TV. Pat's drastic decision to call Unsolved Mysteries would indeed solve the mystery of who he was. However, the truth about who Pat was is not what you think. It would turn out some of the clues that Pat had sort of naturally recalled in those 4 years that he was kind of figuring out who he was were indeed clues of his former life. He really was a married father. Those 3 names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, those were the names of his wife and his 2 sons. Pat was his wife, and Joel and Chris were his 2 sons. And he really was a devout Catholic, which is why he was able to remember all of those prayers. But some of the other clues he thought of over those 4 years, like his incredible aptitude for math, or the fact that he could use an adding machine without looking, or the fact that he understood the stock market so easily, those were clues about his former life, but specifically, they were clues about why Pat was in this position in the first place. It would turn out Pat Brown was actually a man named Carl Brodnick Jr. And Carl Brodnick Jr. was a wanted felon who had misappropriated tens of thousands of dollars from the advertising agency where he worked as an accountant. And Carl had been under serious criminal investigation when he suddenly disappeared from his home in Indiana on July 8th, 1994, which is 5 days before Pat Brown woke up in that ditch on the side of the road with a lump on his head, markings on his wrist, and having no idea who he was or what happened to him. Now, there has never been a perfect explanation for what actually happened to Carl, but if you think about this logically, his claim of having amnesia is very likely true. Why would a guy use amnesia as his cover story to flee the law, run to Cheyenne, Wyoming and say, "I don't know who I am, I don't know what happened to me," only to then, a few years later, go on national TV and out himself and totally make himself a target for the police? It doesn't make any sense. And then also adding credibility to this idea that maybe something happened to Carl versus Carl running off to save himself is we know that when Carl disappeared on July 8th, 1994 from his home in Indiana, he took out $1,000 in cash from his checking account and then also took out another large sum of cash from his home's second mortgage. However, when he woke up in that ditch, all the money was gone. He just had 23 cents in his pocket. Now, after Carl vanished from his house in Indiana, police did go looking for him because he was under criminal investigation, so they wanted to find him, and they pretty quickly found his car 250 miles away from his home in a strip mall parking lot in Missouri, but there was no sign of Carl anywhere. And then right after the police found his car, they checked Carl's credit card, and they discovered it had just been used in Colorado, so 900 miles away, to buy clothes. But when they went to that store and tried to find security footage of, when that transaction took place, there was no footage. And so there was no way of knowing if Carl really was the guy in Colorado making that transaction or if somebody else had his credit card. And then after that, there were no other leads. Nobody had any idea what happened to Carl. His family didn't know, the police had nothing to go on, and so very quickly his case went cold. Until 4 years later, when that episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired. Now, there are many theories about what could have happened to Carl, but the leading theory, that again is just a theory, is that Carl may have been in debt to some very dangerous people. And so when he fled his home in Indiana, it's very likely that he was not running from the law, even though he was under criminal investigation. He was actually running from these dangerous people. And that the reason he might have been stealing from his company was to pay off these dangerous people, but apparently it wasn't enough. Hence why he decided to just kind of take off and run away. And these dangerous people seemed to have caught up to him, and they captured him, and it looked like they tied his wrists at some point because of the marks on his wrist, and they very likely tortured him or something, hence why he had this very serious head injury, and then it seems like they dumped him on the side of the road, very likely to die. They might have thought he was dead already, but he didn't die, and when he came to, he must have really had amnesia from the injuries he sustained from these bad people that chased him down. But again, that's just a theory. When Carl's episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired, it was his wife, Pat Brodnick, who was the one who saw him on TV and couldn't believe it and called it in. And then when she called this in, at first, Pat was reunited with his family, and it was this big happy reunion. Pat comes back home, he sees his wife and his kids, and then he's immediately arrested and prosecuted for embezzlement. Now, ultimately, Carl would plead guilty to the charges against him, but he would say the whole time, I don't remember committing this crime. I don't remember anything. And so ultimately, Carl did not get sent to prison. He instead served time on probation, and then after it was over, he just went back to living as Carl Brodnick Jr., despite still having huge gaps in his memory. At least, according to Carl. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear.